Hello, GWC members. As you know, our January meeting is usually a seed exchange. And because of COVID this year, we can't all gather to exchange seeds. So I thought, what would be the next best thing we could do? And I thought, propagation. Maybe we could learn about propagation. I certainly know I needed to. So I contacted Chris over at the Arboretum, and he recommended Leanne Kenealy to speak to us about propagation, and she has agreed to do that. Leanne grew up in Florida and attended Clemson University, which is a land grant school with a strong ag program like NC State. And while she was there, she worked on peach tree breeding and research on annuals. And when she graduated, she moved to the Moore Farms Botanical Garden in Salt Lake in South Carolina. And her job there was to schedule and propagate and maintain the nursery and the greenhouse for the gardens, the botanical gardens. And for those of us that go to Duke Gardens and we really like that annual garden that you see there, someone has to keep the supply of plants coming for those beautiful shows, and that was Leanne at the Moore Farms Botanical Garden. She then moved to Hoffman University in North Carolina that specializes in ornamental and native grasses. And there she worked to update their greenhouse facilities, to standardize and expand their existing plant trials. And she also worked to improve the trays in which they grow plants so that they can then transport them and get planted with less trauma to the plants. Then she moved over to the J.C. Ralston Arboretum, where she was on the team as a plant breeder and a nursery tech. And she conducted the very last of the in-person workshops held at the Arboretum last year on February 29th, just about exactly a year ago, on grafting deciduous conifers. Now, tonight, she's going to be sharing with us about propagation, and Leanne has been working in this last year to establish her own business, Dynamic Plants. She describes herself as a plant nerd, and she's going to share with us some of what she loves, what she's learned in design, and her knowledge of unique plants, and bring it to us. So I'm really happy to introduce Leanne Kenealy to us tonight. Thank you, Leanne, for being here.
From where the plant is from, what zone it is, that's sort of how you gauge how long the seed wants to be stratified for. But a lot of your woodies, conifers, they need the cold. So if you collect them in the fall and try to sow them immediately, they won't do anything because they haven't broken that dormancy. Imbibition and soaking a seed. Imbibition is that initial swell of the seed when the seed coat is broken and it's absorbing water and sort of turning on all of those sleeping forces it has in order to get the seed to germinate. So imbibition is why we break the seed coat with scarification in certain species, or why we soak seeds. I don't know, there are some things I soak that just make them go faster. They don't need it, but like beets or kales, if you soak them overnight and sow them, you have a kale plant in like a week. So it's fun to do with kids because instant gratification helps. But yeah, soaking seeds just overnight can sometimes just give them a head start. And then once they actually get sown and they're in a heated space, they just really hit the ground running. Seeds are really important because they give us a chance for mutations. That's why I have that picture of all the Japanese maples up there. There are other ways to get mutations, but seedlings are kind of the most fun way. You know, you sow a big plot of seeds and they all start to come up and they have these little differences, and that's typically how new cultivars are produced. Sometimes we push them in a direction, but at the end of the day, it's always just a big flat of seeds that you sort of watch as they push up. So that's why I really love seed propagation. Um, Thinking about how the seed naturally germinates in the wild. This goes for a lot of things. It's always important to know where the plant is from and what it might experience on its own, because then you can sort of mimic that. Um, so germinating conifer seeds, like they could need a double dormancy. They could need to go through multiple winters before they germinate because they're from such a cold location. Um, it's a plant that lives on riverbanks. It might want to be soaked overnight. It might naturally be, it might naturally germinate as it's bouncing around, the side of a riverbank. So it's always sort of a fun thing to keep in mind when we look at seeds. Um, storage, storage is important. Annuals and vegetables tend to be really forgiving. I just have like a bag of them in a cabinet, and they last a long time. You can also refrigerate them, but I tend to just refrigerate my perennials, trees and shrubs, um, ones that might have a little more to them, sort of like fat and moisture wise. That's what's going to cause them to rot or to mold. So refrigeration helps with that. Containers, although glass containers and Ziploc bags are really convenient, they also hold in that moisture. And the biggest thing to think about when we think about seed storage is dry, keeping them dry. And glassine packets are my favorite. They are sort of like parchment paper. They might be exactly like parchment paper, actually. But they allow some breathing room, and but also are not going to fall apart like a paper bag. But paper bags are also fine because they're going to absorb excess excess moisture. Envelopes work great. Um, same same strategy. It's just any excess moisture in that seed when you collect it is going to go into that paper. It's not just going to sit and rot that seed. And airtight jars and Tupperware are fine. It's just nice to throw in something that will absorb that moisture as well. People use mothballs. I've seen a lot of strategies to this. Cotton balls, because they'll absorb that moisture if you do want to use plastic. Yeah, I mean, some of these annuals and vegetables, I've seen tomato seeds last forever, but these are sort of what I was taught and what is generally seen. But there are some crazy stories about um, perennial seeds last. Verbascum. I don't know if you guys know about that, but Denny Werner just taught me a couple years ago that verbascum is actually one of the longest preserved seeds. We've found 200-year-old little glass containers of verbascum seeds, which is crazy because it sort of looks like a lamb's ear with like a big like panicle of yellow flowers. It's a perennial, but they last forever. Conifers and trees, you can hang on to a pine cone for forever in all types of situations, and as long as it's dry and safe, it's good to go. Okay, cuttings. So I was taught when I was at Clemson by my propagation professor that we're always looking for the mama bear cutting. I love that. I think about this to this day. And if you're ever hanging out with propagators or walking around a garden, you will find them like bending the twigs or the branches of something, because there is this level of maturity that is a prime time for taking cuttings of something. You don't want it to be too soft because it will melt and wilt immediately, but you don't want it to be too woody because it doesn't have those juvenile cells that are going to create those new roots. So the mama bear cutting, that like a little bit soft but a little bit woody cutting, it's going to have the longevity to survive in a propagation situation, but is also going to have juvenile enough cells to create new roots. And obviously clones is what we're talking about when we're talking about cuttings, which is nice, that you're getting exactly what you cut from. And that's in the nursery industry huge. We're always telling people that exactly what they're getting on a tag, so it needs to be that thing. It needs to be exactly like the parent plant. Seasonality. This is another big one. Every plant has its season that it's going to be the most successful in. Some plants have three. Camellia tends to be one that I teach about because it has to do with the texture and the maturity of the branch as well as the season. You can take a very soft cutting of a camellia in the fall and it will root, or you can take a woodier cutting in the spring and it will root. I hope that makes sense, but it's like as the season goes on and that wood matures and gets a little harder, you can still take camellia cuttings almost all year. You'll just sort of change where it is that you're taking the cutting from. So yeah, a lot of woody plants, conifers, especially. I know Sandy Horn's on here, whom I love, and shares my love of conifers. And that is, prime propagation time. Everybody, I think, has an idea that we're not really propagating in spring, but the greenhouse is actually more busy in the winter, perhaps, than in the summer, because most plants in the summer are so stressed out and tired that they don't want to be propagated. And once fall rolls around and they're done, eating and flowering, they are much more likely to root for you. So every plant has its own seasonality, but well, then you have things like coleus and salvias, which you can propagate pretty much as long as they're upright, and you'll be fine. But for a lot of specialty plants, there is a correct season or time. Rhododendrons have, I think, the smallest window, in my opinion. It's this sort of magic moment that happens in late May, early June, and it changes every year. Be wary of any propagation book that tells you an exact date for a time to propagate something, because every year is so different depending on when the last frost was and things like that. But that's when that bending of the stem really matters. For rhododendrons, it needs to like snap in this certain way where it's like just past the softwood, where it's ready to be propagated. So it's kind of fun. There's like a mystery to certain plants. And now I'll go into the three most common types of cuttings that you would do at home. So these are stem cuttings. I think this is what we're all most commonly, this is what you'll commonly see when someone says cutting is a stem cutting. Cutting back the leaves is important, usually 50%, sometimes more if they're huge leaves. Coming back to making the plant focus, the more leaf tissue available, the more it's trying to photosynthesize, the more it's trying to open and close its stomata. So it just holds in, it helps lock in that moisture because there's less opportunity to open and close its pores. 4 to 6 inch cuttings are important too. The longer the cutting, the more you're sort of pressuring the fixed amount of nutrients and water it has left to sort of go all the way up this thing. So 4 to 6 inches, pretty much max for anything. And wounding the bottom of a woody cutting, you can see it on the top left, how there's sort of like a notch cut on the lower inch of the cutting. That is just opening up the cambium layer, that bright green layer just inside the bark. You're opening that up to the hormone that you're going to put on it. It's just easier for woodier things to sort of give it a leg up. Coleus is all cambium. A lot of perennials are pretty much all cambium. The softer it is, you wouldn't need to do that because it's just going to absorb it and immediately start rooting. Calluses On those, so those are Brugmansia on the bottom right. And you can see those sort of like warty white things that are happening just above the roots. And that's where your roots are going to come from, are these little calluses where the cells of the plant are freaking out and basically like, okay, we're missing a major point of what we do. What is that? And they're called totipotent cells. And they can actually transform into whatever type of cell the plant needs. And in this case, it would be roots. Um, so if you see white calluses, you're doing something right. That's what you want. And that is where the roots will sort of come from. This is a Magnolia grandiflora cutting I took when I was at Moore Farms. They were really ramping up their collection, and I did a bunch of cuttings of these. And I always put this in here because it's one of the tougher cuttings to do, and I was sort of proud of these guys. And it takes a full 6 to 12 months for Magnolia grandifloras to root, typically. K. Paris is the quickest one, but getting this kind of root system on a Magnolia is not something that's going to be done at home, but it's just an example of how long it can sit and be perfectly healthy and happy, but not be rooted yet. So I'm sure that'll happen with you guys if you do try some of these at home. Be patient, because a lot of them are perfectly fine as long as they're green and they look happy. They are just doing their thing. Rotting is the number one cause of cutting failure. So like we talked about with the misting tool, it's important to just saturate your water entirely, before you stick your cuttings. And then that should be the only legitimate watering that has to happen, especially in a home situation. So misting the leaves every day, a couple times a day is enough. Leaf cuttings. Leaf cuttings are fun. I especially love working with young kids with these because it just seems crazy. Like even to me now, it just seems insane that we can cut a piece of a begonia leaf off and just lay it on the soil, and you'll get these little begonias that pop up from the base. That's the bottom center. The Sansevieria plant on the top right, same thing. You can just cut 20 cuttings out of one Sansevieria leaf, and they'll just pop right up from the wound. It'll form a callus like we talked about, and then from there, new plants will emerge. I always put eucomis in here because everybody laughed at Tony Ava when he was sticking leaf cuttings of eucomis, and he even did it as sort of a joke, and then it worked. And that is how we all do it now. So I try to remember things like that because propagation is part science, part art, and there's always room for trying new and weird things. So take a leaf cutting off something and see if it works, because it's basically free and you never know. So yeah, these are fun. Root cuttings. Root cuttings are sort of my last resort. If I really am struggling to propagate something, I'll try a root cutting. And what I think about most often is Daphnes. Daphnes can be really tough to root depending on the species, but like Daphne odoras, those beautiful winter blooming Daphnes, root cuttings is the way to go. And you get almost 100% take. Like you can see, I guess in this bottom right picture, you literally just cut a little couple inch piece off the root system, and you can either stick it like a cutting, which is fine, or you can just lay it on top of the soil, like on the bottom left, and they just have a new shoot that pops right out of that root system. It's amazing, but it really does work. And yeah, again, for like those hard to root species, if there's something you're really struggling with, root cuttings might be the option. Speaking of laying things down like that, I just realized you can also do Brugmansia like that. Doug Bruin at the Arboretum taught me this just last year, and they will root from normal stem cuttings, but I watched him hack off this huge Brugmansia stem and chop it into pieces and lay it on top of this flat of soil. and there was 20 plants, like there was one off every little node that came up, and we broke them apart and potted them up and put them on the plant cart. So it's very cool. It's not necessarily technically a root cutting, but again, it's somewhere in between because you're just sort of laying a stem cutting down, halfway nestled in the soil. It's almost like a root cutting. So room to mess around with these things for sure. Divisions are great, and there's a lot out there to be divided. We generally do this in the winter. If you think again about just wanting the plant to concentrate on roots, the winter is actually the best time to divide pretty much anything because they are done making flowers, which is by far the most stressful thing a plant can do. Yeah, big picture, you don't want to propagate anything when it's flowering. You can think about it like being pregnant, like all of the plant's energy is going towards making a new generation. So they've got no energy left for creating a whole new plant. So the winter is great. They're also not photosynthesizing. They're not creating any new foliage. So that's a great time to sort of dig things up and tear them apart. When I dig something up to try to divide it and put it into some new pots, I typically do cut the roots back a good bit. And I don't know, there are also debates on this. Doug Ruin gets upset at me when he sees me cutting back roots, but there is some research about how cutting back roots is sort of the same as pruning. You get a lot of new growth, new revitalized growth. So if you have a small root system you're working with, it's kind of nice to chop the ends of it off, certainly to cut the top back pretty severely. For whatever it is, a grass or a bulb, there shouldn't be a lot going on above ground. Oh, and drainage is just like anything in propagation, drainage is the thing to keep an eye on. Overwatering is your enemy because there are just not a lot of roots there to take up any extra water. So it's important to just watch your drainage, add perlite. If you're dividing a lily or a grass and you've torn it up into different sections, just mix some extra perlite in with your media for that first stage until it's kind of, and you don't have to pot up a division also. You can divide something and throw it right back into the ground right next to its parent plant. But if you're going to do a plant share or something like that, and you are going to pot it up, some extra perlite can't hurt. For bulbs, I put this anatomy of a tulip bulb up here because you do want to make sure you're cutting it entirely in half or in like a perfect quarter, because you do need all of these pieces. You need that basal stem, you need part of the roots, you need part of the flower bud. You don't necessarily need the tunic, that outer covering, but you need that basal stem especially. So it's not like a grass, we can just tear it into a million pieces. You need that basal stem in order for new roots to show up. Oh, these are some fun pictures of Hop and Nursery. To show you the importance of cutting back the tops, this machine on the right is called a super cutter, and a company made this, I think it was out of Germany or Japan. Anyways, it was the most fun and gratifying thing. For any of you that love ironing or vacuuming like I do, this was so fun. You can sort of see in a couple of these that we've pushed this super cutter, which is basically a lawnmower. It's like a big hedge clipper, but we push it on that rack, like down those big rows. And we would do this almost every week, especially when things were growing really fast. And this is not home propagation, but to show you the importance of cutting back the tops when you're sort of allowing the plant to focus. It's the same in a big nursery or at home, but I just had the most fun. There was like a big bag, like a lawnmower bag, like you can see in the bottom left, that would collect all the trimmings. It was crazy. It's too fun. Um, these greenhouses were gorgeous, and they are wholesale, which is unfortunate, but they do sell to some great retail spots, and they have the coolest grasses ever. They're really beautiful. So grafting is not going to be a first step for anyone in propagation, but it is my favorite thing, so I always talk about it for a second. Pat McCracken is the most important grafter. Him and Ted Stevens, they're at least in the top 5 in the United States, and they're real close. Real close by in Wendell. Garden Treasures is his new nursery, but he taught me how to graft 10 years ago now. And I've just had the most fun with it. It really is simple, and it's another class, but there are a lot of plants that you have to graft that will not root on their own, especially a lot of these tiny little conifers, uh, things that are variegated or dwarf or weeping. This is pretty much all you got. So it's sort of fruit production is how I started grafting, but it's just as important in ornamentals. And this was my first big bald cypress grafting project. I think we did like 30 different cultivars of bald cypress, which I'm still very obsessed with. But anyways, it's an important part of propagation, big picture. Oh, layering is a good one at home. So I actually just kind of got into this in the last like 5 years. But they're selling all these new cool things, like these black little ball things on the right. It used to be back in the day that like you just took like a plastic bag or a part of a garbage bag even, and you just packed it with soil and wrapped it around, your rose. I think this is a rose on the left. Um, it needs to have a bud or a node in there, and it helps to sort of whittle away the bark, especially the woodier the plant is. The idea is you're just opening up that cambium layer and adding some hormone into there with a paintbrush, however you want to do it. Your gloved fingertip is fine. And then you sort of wrap that plastic, whatever it is, homemade or bought. These are on Etsy, which is so funny. But yeah, you then, once it's rooted, you just cut beneath it and you have a plant. I know a lot of people that do these with different hydrangeas, different rhododendrons and azaleas, because azaleas can be really hard to root, and that is what a lot of people want to propagate. But this is a good option for it, especially in the spring and summer. So yeah, it's sort of a fun thing to play with that's low cost and can be so much fun if it works. Definitely, I don't know, try on like a fig or a mulberry. Those are easy ones to sort of try and successfully root. But it's just so fun. Again, if you like have any young people, like young children around, they freak out about this. It's just too much fun. So this is simple layering versus air layering. Again, it needs to have a node or a bud that is submerged underground, and you can use anything. It doesn't have to be this landscape staple. It can be a brick. It can be anything you have on hand. You can just grab a branch and sort of bend it so that it's touching the ground. And to talk about light again, one of the issues that certain plants can have with being rooted in water on a windowsill is that there is light. It's a hormonal thing that takes place in darkness that tells the plant to make a root. And we have a cat. So yeah, it can be fun to just again scrape off a little bit of the bark, add some hormone, and sort of bend that branch into the soil, and cover it up and kind of just go back and check on it. And if it does root, you can just take your pruners and cut, sort of right where the landscape stake is in this picture on the left, just outside of where the new root system is. And then you can dig it up and put it anywhere, into a pot, wherever you'd like. I've had a lot of luck with this. Again, it's one of those things where if you've struggled to take cuttings and it's like difficult to collect seed, it can be a cool alternative that is cheap. And it happens in nature all the time. I'm sure you guys have experienced plants that do this on their own. There are a bunch of tree species that unfortunately do it on their own, but it is a totally valid form of propagation. So I think I've gone quickly, but this is my grandfather's backyard in Los Angeles, California. And when he passed away, I propagated everything from back here. I randomly have a huge collection of plumeria and things that don't grow here that are in a greenhouse. The camellias do, but I think of propagation as a really special way to remember an event or people. I do a lot of propagation for people if their grandparents have to sell a home and they have plants they really love. It's just a great way to take a piece of a place or a person with you, and yeah, it can be meaningful. I do a lot of wedding bouquet propagation. It's pretty fun. Okay, so don't use this email. I need to get you guys my actual email, but oh, how do I get back on here?
Okay, Leanne, we have several questions in the chat room.
Okay, great.
Are you able to look there, or would you like me to read them to you?
You can read them to me. I'm trying to figure out how to.
Okay, I'll be glad to do
Oh,
that.
I can see them now. Okay, peaches. I think that's the first one. You can grow most peach cultivars here. North Carolina is a great peach state. I will say though, you have to be comfortable using fungicides. I've had people that have luck without it, but in general, the humidity here, which is great for them in a lot of ways, also brings with it a lot of fungal pathogens. And if we have a heavy rain in the summer, you can end up getting those mummies. I love Contender. Contender is probably my favorite cultivar. Contender, Red Havens are really good. But yeah, Freedom Tree Farm is a tree nursery that they sell saplings online. So, okay, please comment on your /nursery definition of soil. Is the potting mix sterilized? So no, I mean, I've worked in labs where we had to sterilize the soil, and when I was working with those Magnolia grandifloras, we sterilized the soil because it takes so long for them to root. But at home, and even for my nursery that I'm working on, I don't sterilize the soil. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's totally necessary. Do rooting hormone products have a shelf life? Yeah, some of them do. The powdered forms have a longer shelf life. And you can get ones that you mix with water and then are liquid. That's what I used a lot at in previous nurseries, but they should tell you on the package. And it is typically pretty long. I think it's like years, but the packaging should tell you on individual products. Serving hormone with a long shelf life. Hormidin, that's the only one I can say for sure. Hormidin stays great for a long time. And other than Dip and Grow, that's sort of been the standard for years. And I definitely, I mean, at the Arboretum, we have some real old Hormerdin that has worked really well. So, and it should be pretty cost effective. And a little does go a long way. I will say with the gel, you use a lot of it because when you dip the cutting in the gel, it takes so much with it, which is kind of cool. And I think it's sort of why it works, but you go through a lot of it. So the powders and the soluble liquid versions, they'll last longer for you. How long had the magnolia on your stem cutting slide been rooting, and when was the cutting taken? That's a great question. So magnolias bloom for a really long time. So like I said, you want to wait till after things are done blooming or before blooming to take the cutting. Strangely, magnolias want to be propagated in August and September, which never happens. That's when everyone is upset at their life and doesn't want anything to do except to like go to sleep for the winter. But magnolias and a lot of other tropical plants that love that heat and humidity do want to be propagated in August, September. So that's kind of when they're done blooming. I think the reason I took that picture was because it had been sitting on the Miss Bench for a year. They're not all like that. Like I said, Magnolia K. Paris, that roots very quickly in terms of grandifloras, but quickly still means 2 months. You mentioned fungicide. Oh, fungus as a possible problem in the greenhouse. What other pests are experienced and what control measures are effective? Are systemics employed? So inside my house, the only issues I've ever had are mealybugs, and they are terrible. It's good to catch it early. I don't use any chemicals in my house just because I've got cats and I feel weird about it. I do in my little greenhouse in the back. I have used systemics for mealybugs. Safari is a good one. But inside, I really do just try to like get a Q-tip and like if I do see mealybugs, just like get them all, like squish them individually. I know that sounds silly, but if you're not doing a ton, it's not that bad, you know. That's the only big one I've had in my house. I think outside is where, I don't know if you guys did any fall vegetables, but the caterpillars this year were insane on my seedlings. I feel like I'm still dealing with them now, but I used a lot of BT powder for cabbage moths this year. Fungus, the way that I get rid of fungus itself is just to dry things out. If I see that I have fungus building somewhere, I just like really back off on the water hard. That's the best thing you can do. Also, if you have algae or fungus building on your soil, you can add sand or more perlite to the top. That's also a good way to get rid of fungus gnats. If they appear in your home, they will not land on sand or perlite or anything dry. So they just move on with their life if you add some of that. Have you ever tried to air layer Daphne? I have not, because the only ones I propagated were from the Arboretum and they're so pretty, I didn't want to mess with it. If it was in my backyard though, I probably would have tried, but the root cuttings do work on those guys, but give it a try. Let me know. Edgeworthia is flowering now, so not now. It's one of those like rare winter bloomers, but in the spring, early spring, even through midsummer, they're actually pretty forgiving. 4-inch cuttings, cut the leaves in half, wound the bottom a little bit. And yeah, they're really nice. They root pretty quickly, or at least like in, I don't know, 2 to 4 weeks, which I hope that sounds quick to you guys. It is to me, but like everything else, it's a patience thing with plants. Pitcher plants. I have divided them in the fall successfully, fall and winter. I don't know that you can't do it in the spring. I've just been too scared to. So yeah, I would suggest fall and winter, like other things. I have pecan trees. Is grafting still the main method of propagation? And what is the best rootstock? That's a great question. I've never grafted Carya. You can stick cuttings. I've stuck cuttings before. I can write that down and try to figure that out. I have friends that are really into Carya. I'm sure there is. I'm sure there is a rootstock that's best for the Southeast. We're really lucky right now. There's so much research going on rootstocks that are made specific for your climate and area. So our wet winters tend to be one of the biggest issues for sapling trees. So there might be a rootstock that's made for that. It's worth a Google, but I can try to find out also. Does it take years for a rose cutting to grow and bloom? No. You can get a rose cutting to a 1 gallon in a year. I'll safely say that, and it will bloom. I did some for a friend from a wedding bouquet once, and it was solidly in a 1 gallon after 1 year. I did fertilize it a lot, and I did put it outside a bit once it had, properly rooted, but not too long. But yeah, 1 year, I would say. Any special advice for deciduous plants? Clethra, that's a good one. So deciduous plants are different, but you can root them in the winter. You can root Clethra in the winter, but you can also root it in the spring. That's one that's also pretty forgiving. I would almost go with, if you try it now, like I said, if you have a plant, always try it, because things break rules. But typically when I try to propagate those is with fresh wood stuff in May, late April, May. But there are other deciduous things that want to be propagated, like pear trees. I propagate pear trees from cuttings in the winter. Apple trees, I don't know, even like viburnums. There are some viburnums that are deciduous that I stick cuttings of in the winter. And like I said, a deciduous cutting, they're not eating, right? They're not photosynthesizing, so it's tough. But a lot of them also, it's kind of a plus. If you can get them to sort of kickstart and make that first leaf, then you're sort of good to go. How do you propagate clematis or clematis? I never know what I'm supposed to say. That like mama bear growth, so not the super flimsy stuff, but that moderately flimsy stuff is great. You can also collect seed. I've collected Clethra or clematis seed before. I've only done the like Henry eyes, but they root from cuttings. Yeah, I don't know. Again, like 4 inches, take off a lot of the leaves, either before or after blooming. But cuttings should work great. You could also probably layer it. You could probably grab some of that vine and twist it down. I've never tried it specifically with clematis, but most vines love to be layered. If you think about the way they sort of regenerate from those nodes, it would make sense that they would be happy to do that. Cinnamon as a rooting hormone. I have heard about this before, but I have never tried it. There are like a few really cool, methods out there for sort of organic rooting hormones. You can, I guess, soak cattails in water, like take cattail cuttings and soak them in water. And they have a huge amount of that natural rooting hormone called auxin. So you can then take your cuttings of another plant and dip it in that water the cattails are in. That's supposed to work. I have not actually tried any of these, if I'm being perfectly honest. I've only ever used purchased rooting hormones because they're there and they're great, and wear gloves and you'll be fine. Oh, thanks. Deciduous azaleas. Yeah, those are tricky. How do you propagate deciduous azaleas is the question. Yeah, it's that mama bear cutting, and it is a weird thing, but if you try to get it to where if you bend it, you can sort of hear it snap. Like the first 4 to 6 inches of new growth, when you get it to where you hear it kind of cleanly snap, that's where you want it. You don't want it to like bend and be really woody, but you also don't want it to just like flop over. So yeah, deciduous azaleas are tough, but try layering, try to take some cuttings. Um, I've had success layering it before. Of course, you know, in my previous jobs, the horticulturists don't want me out there messing with their plants and like weirdly taking branches and putting bricks on them. But so I've been pushed to try to propagate them. But I have had a lot of people say that layering works. Thank you guys so much. Let me see. When is the best time to take a winter Daphne rooted cutting? When they're done blooming. So late winter, early spring, that's been best for me. And yeah, just anytime they're not actively blooming has been successful. Summer, really hot summer is also probably not a good idea because they're stressed. But so yeah, fall even, and that like late winter, early spring is probably great. Oh, thank you all so much.
All right.
This is very
Well, Leanne, let me thank you again. I see you've had several thanks on the board there tonight, but that was so informative and so well explained for those of
I'm so
us
glad.
who aren't who don't have that degree that you do. So thank you for sharing your time and your efforts and your knowledge tonight. We appreciate it.
I had so much fun. Thank you so much for having me.
It was our pleasure, certainly.